Okay, students, I think today we're going to talk a little bit about the scientific method, and I'm hoping that you were able to watch the first couple of videos over Chapter 1 that talked about what sociology is. We talked about whether sociology should be considered a science or not, how it compares to other social sciences, how it compares to the natural sciences. And one of the things that we said about sociology is that the reason that we call it a science and consider it a science is that we are trying to understand society by collecting data and systematically observing what's happening in society, how that influences individuals, how individuals influence the larger society through things like social movements and protests and things of that nature. So today we're going to talk a little bit about that process of gathering data systematically, developing theories, testing those theories using the research method. So just as chemistry and biology and physics and the hard sciences, or so-called natural sciences, use the scientific method, we're going to talk about how sociologists also use the research process and the scientific method in order to gather data and to share that information with other researchers who then can use it to develop their own theories, tweak their own theories, and hopefully create a better science that has a better understanding of why humans interact in the ways that they do. And so the first step of the scientific method, the scientific process, the research process, is to figure out what it is you want to discuss, what it is you want to research and understand better. And so we call that defining the problem. You have to identify the variables that you think are important. So for example, if you're looking at prison populations and you note that a large percentage of people who are in prison happen to be people of color, then one theory that you might develop is that perhaps race is somehow related to criminal behavior. And so then you start gathering data, and so your assertion is perhaps that race or some other factors associated with race might influence whether someone gets involved in criminal activities, whether they're charged for those criminal activities, and what kind of sentences they get if they're convicted of those criminal activities. When I was at LSU working on my PhD coursework, we were given this problem to examine, and what we found was that when you look at the alleged relationship between race and crime, if you enter into the discussion socioeconomic status and you control for socioeconomic status, which has to do with social class and how much money a family earns and things of that nature, that the relationship, the alleged relationship between race and crime totally disappears. Okay, so what that means is that the way we would interpret that is that it's not race that influences crime, it's actually socioeconomic status. And because people of color, minorities, are disproportionately located in the lower classes, that means that a higher percentage of them are going to be likely to be involved in criminal activities as a result of socioeconomic status. So in other words, if whites, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans were all equally distributed through the socioeconomic status or structure in the same percentages, then we wouldn't see differences in the percentages of people who were in prison based on race. That it's really all about socioeconomic status. We'll talk about that more as we get to Chapter 7, okay, which is deviance and crime. So, but today we're talking about the research process, and so we have to define our variables, the variables that we think are important, and of course that's going to come, a lot of those variables will be identified by the particular sociological theory or paradigm. If we're a conflict theorist, we're probably going to think that inequality has something to do with the differential rates of conviction for crimes by different racial categories. If we're a structural functionalist, we might look at how the economy influences different groups and how, for some people, college works well. And the traditional American dream of working hard and getting a good education increases the potential for upward social mobility. But perhaps we're going to focus on the education institution and say, well, this institution's really not working well for all groups, and therefore some people are being left out of the move for upward social mobility. And if we're a symbolic interactionist, we might look more closely at what's happening within families of people of color, and we might want to look at the socialization process and see if non-intact families have higher rates of crime and juvenile delinquency than families that are able to remain intact with two parents in the household. Okay, so the particular sociological paradigm or theory that we're working from will certainly influence the variables that we think are important in a particular relationship. But the first step is defining the problem and figuring out what variables you think might be valuable in explaining a particular behavior. Well, the next thing you do once you define your problem is you have to, what one of my professors used to call wallow in the literature. You need to go to the library, or you need to, today you don't have to go to the library anymore. You can get online and you can do searches of peer-reviewed journals and look for previous research. Okay. And so by looking at what other researchers have already discovered, you can avoid making the same mistakes they made. You can identify variables that they thought were important, and in some cases maybe they found theoretical and research support that, hey, yes, these variables are important and those variables are not, so we don't have to really pay as much attention to those things, although you have to be careful about that because we know a lot of times the things that we believe to be true turn out not to be true. But certainly, looking at previous researchers, doing that library research, finding out what previous researchers have explored and what their findings have shown them will help you to avoid some of the same mistakes perhaps that they made, and will help you to refine your study. And that leads us to the next step, where typically we expect to develop hypotheses. Okay, so we've defined our problem and identified the variables that we think are important. We have done some library research into previous research to see what have other researchers found when they've explored these particular relationships between these variables. And now we're developing a hypothesis, which, as you guys have heard, in the past, that developing a hypothesis involves, making an educated guess about what you think is going to happen when you gather your data. And so it's certainly that's an adequate, or at least an appropriate way of looking at it, but it may not be adequate. Developing your hypotheses means that you're looking at all the variables that you think are going to influence your dependent variables. Okay, so now we're talking about independent and dependent variables. Independent variables are thought to cause a change in dependent variables. So, for example, if we're looking at the relationship between education and income, we might say that, well, having a good education is going to lead to a higher income. But we could also say, in that case, if we're saying that education leads to a higher income, then education is our independent variable, and income, which depends on our education level, then becomes our dependent variable, right? But we could also say that, family income determines whether or not children are likely to go to college and get more education. And so in this case, because we're saying that the family's income, mom and dad's income, affects whether or not they are able to send their children to college, now income becomes the independent variable and education becomes the dependent variable. So just because one variable is the independent variable in one study, that doesn't mean that it can't be the dependent variable in another study. So independent and dependent variables are important, and that can be kind of confusing sometimes, but if you just remember that changes in the independent variable cause changes in the dependent variable. In other words, the dependent variable depends on what's going on with the independent variable. You can usually keep that separated. And then we have what we call control variables, which I mentioned just a moment ago when we were looking at the relationship, the alleged relationship between race and crime. But we introduced a control variable into it and said, well, now wait a minute, let's look at race in the context of social classes, and we're going to compare lower class African Americans to lower class whites to lower class Hispanics to lower class Asian Americans. And what we see when we do that is that the differences in the races totally disappear because we're only looking at everybody who's in the same socioeconomic status, and when we do that, the differences between the races disappear. And so it becomes apparent that involvement in crime is not related to race, but it's related to an individual's financial situation, their socioeconomic status. Okay? So we've defined our problem, we've gone to the library and we've done our research and seen what other researchers have determined. We've developed our hypothesis. Now it's time to select and collect our methodology. We're going to select a research methodology. Are we going to use surveys? Are we going to use experiments? Are we going to use existing data? What kind of method are we going to use to gather our data? And so we have to select a methodology. We have to go out and collect our data. And then we have to analyze that data. And then lastly, we have to report our findings so that we can share our research with other researchers who've already been interested in this topic and who continue to research in this area to provide more information for future researchers to hopefully improve our theories, to make them better, to tweak them. Theories are not perfect and they're never final. We're always trying to improve whatever theories we develop, and that's not just true of the social sciences. The natural sciences are constantly refining as we develop better techniques for gathering data, as we develop better telescopes that allow us to see further back into the universe. Physicists are constantly refining their theories about the nature of the universe, and the same is true of the social sciences. We are constantly trying to improve our theories, and the way that we do that is by evaluating research that's been done by others, trying to figure out if they've measured the variables appropriately, and we'll get into reliability and validity issues. And so those 5 steps: defining the problem, reviewing the literature, developing hypotheses, selecting our data collection methodology and collecting and analyzing our data, and then reporting our results to other people through peer-reviewed journals and publishing our articles. That is what comprises this research methodology, this scientific method that allows us to grow the body of knowledge of science. Okay, and so every science is in the same boat in that respect. We're all using the same kind of inquiry to figure out how the universe works, whatever part of the universe that we're studying. So, we could look at the relationship, for example, between household income and education, and so you've got a couple of maps in your textbook that show that, and if you look at the map of household income and then you compare it to the map of education levels, you're going to find that there's a lot of overlap. A lot of the states that are high in educational level are also high in family income, and those that are relatively low in education also are relatively low income. Now that's not enough. That's not conclusive enough to say that higher levels of education equals higher levels of income, but it does support that theory, right? And so we can continue to do more research and find out more about that relationship between household income and educational levels, okay? So let's talk about some examples where we might use the scientific method to do sociological research and investigate something. We're talking about this concept between education and income. Is there a relationship there? And so your text asks the question, does it pay to go to college? Okay. Our operational definitions might be education level. And when we talk about operational definitions, this just means that we are going to define how we are going to measure the important variables. Okay, so if we're looking at this relationship between education and earnings, we're going to look at years of formal education. That's how we're going to operationalize the concept or the variable of education. And earnings would be annual income. You could either do it individual income or you could do family income. We've used both of those measures to look at earnings and tie that to educational aspirations. And so if we do a review state by state of comparisons between income and education level, we would see those maps, as I mentioned to you, where you've got the overlap between the states that are high on education and high on income. And like I said, that would be one indicator that perhaps there is a relationship between these things. Of course, there's been a tremendous amount of research into the relationship between education and family income or household income, individual income. And of course, we know that each credential that a person earns tends to add more to their income. So for example, if you're comparing someone who does not have a high school diploma to someone who has a high school diploma, we know that those with the high school diploma on average are going to earn more money. There are exceptions, obviously, but in general. We also know that someone who has an associate's degree is going to likely make more money than someone who has a high school diploma. Someone who has a baccalaureate degree typically is going to make more than someone with an associate's degree. Someone with a master's degree will make more than a baccalaureate degree, and someone with a PhD or a EDD or a JD, if they have a law degree, they're more likely to make more money than someone who has perhaps a master's degree. Okay, so we know that each step up the credentialing ladder does tend to lead to more money. Now, as I said, there are exceptions to that. You've got truck drivers who can make more money than a college professor, but they have less education in most cases, and they certainly have less occupational prestige, and we'll talk about that ranking when we get to the chapter on socioeconomic status. But we know that there are individuals, a certified electrician can make more money than a school teacher. But the school teacher certainly has more prestige in many cases and does different kind of work. And so there are differences in that respect in terms of socioeconomic status. So you also have some charts and some PowerPoints that show different examples of the scientific method. And for example, we believe that there's a relationship between of course, as we said, the level of education that someone earns and their income. You guys believe that, or you wouldn't be taking college classes in an effort to achieve upward social mobility. I had a professor in my undergraduate studies who said that in the Constitution of the United States, we are guaranteed the right to pursue happiness. Now, that doesn't mean that we're guaranteed the right to happiness, right? We know that. Nobody can guarantee that somebody's going to be happy, but we guarantee our citizens the right to pursue happiness. And in his mind, the vehicle in that pursuit was education. That by becoming better educated, you could reduce some of the stress in your life related to socioeconomic issues, financial issues, and that would upward social mobility provides families with opportunities and alternatives. And so we can certainly say that we think there's a relationship there. What about parents taking their children to church? Does that increase the likelihood that when the children grow up that they will continue to go to church? We believe that, and many religious teachers tell you that. They may tell you that, well, yes, your child may rebel during their adolescent years and they may leave the church, but if you've taught them well in the way of the Lord, then they will return to church as adults once they get through that rebellious stage. And so, we do believe that there is some relationship between parents taking their kids to church and then the children attending church as adults themselves. So there are a number of little relationships like that we've kind of identified that we believe are cause and effect relationships. Now, I'm going to warn you that if you really like things to be cut and dried, hey, we know that A causes B, like in a chemistry lab, if you mix two chemicals together and they blow the lab up, then you know in the future if you mix those two chemicals together again under the same conditions, then you would expect another explosion. With human beings, it's much more difficult to prove cause and effect. You can have two young men who grow up in the same family who are identical twins. One becomes a bank robber and the other becomes an attorney. And so it's a little harder to prove cause and effect, causation, with human beings in the social sciences. And so for some students that can be troubling. That can be, it can really frustrate them because they want to know what the truth is. And with human beings, it's a lot harder to discern the truth than it is with inert chemicals that you can take into a laboratory and isolate all the other variables and just focus on one relationship. With human beings, you can seldom do that, and perhaps almost never do that, because we have ethical issues and ethical standards that we have to observe when we're doing research on human subjects. We can't do things that might harm our subjects. So, or if we do something that can harm our subjects, we have to weigh, is the evidence and the knowledge that we gain from this, does it outweigh the potential harms to our subjects? And if the answer is no, then we probably shouldn't be doing that research. Okay, so you've got a number of examples of the scientific method in your textbook and in the PowerPoints, which I will make available to you guys so you can look over those things and get to understand that. Now we want to talk a little bit about different types of data collection methods. I mentioned earlier that step 3 is picking a data collection method and employing it to gather data. Okay, and so in our research designs, which are defined as detailed plans or methods for obtaining data scientifically, we have about 4 or 5 different ways. There are really 4 main ways that we gather data. Now, I say that, and then if we look at experiments, social experiments, you could break that down into quasi-experiments and things of that nature. There are new ways of trying to gather data that kind of fit under the old categories, but they're not perfect fits, okay? So the 4 primary ways that sociologists gather data, the first one is one that you know very well, and that is surveys. We see surveys all the time, whether we're talking about surveys of potential voters, when we do polls, trying to predict who's going to win an election or who's ahead in an election. So surveys are an important way of gathering data. You may have received surveys. If you've been a student at TCC very long, I would say that you've probably received some surveys from us, and I will be sending you guys a little survey that I'll ask you guys to fill out and send back to me, and I'll put that data into Excel, and I'll do some things with it and kind of share some statistics about the class with you that will show you how we can use surveys. Okay, so surveys have to be designed very carefully in order to give us the information that we want to find. There's a real science to developing survey questions and asking questions in the right way and in the right order, not leading our subjects to answer one way or the other. not asking what we call double-barreled questions, which really often are two questions in one. Those are very confusing. Hey, wait a minute. Do I answer question A or question B? They're not always the same question, right? So we have to be very careful about asking double-barreled questions that are really two questions in one that can confuse the subjects. It's very important that you write your questions, your survey questions, in a way that your audience can answer it, or your research subjects can answer the questions without having to try to figure out. You don't want to make people work too hard when they're filling out a survey. You're already imposing on their time, so it's very important that you try to keep your survey as short as you can and still get the information you need. Don't ask a lot of unnecessary questions. Ask them in an order that's going to give you the most valid and reliable responses. Don't ask double-barreled questions. Don't ask confusing questions. And for questions that are kind of, people don't like to answer, questions about things like sexuality and income, you want to leave those questions towards the end of the survey. That way, by the time they get to those questions, they've gotten accustomed to answering questions and giving you information. They feel a little more comfortable sharing with you, hopefully, and now they will answer these kind of more sensitive questions that, criminal record questions, income questions, sexuality questions, those kinds of questions. If they've already invested in the previous questions and they've gotten down to these questions that are now, I'm not so sure I want to answer this, but I've already done, 20 questions. I'm ready. I've kind of committed to this. I'll go ahead and answer the questions in this particular case because they're right at the very end. If you put those questions at the very beginning, sometimes people say, well, I'm not going to fill out the survey. Look at what they're asking me. Okay, so surveys are very, very valuable and very important, and we'll talk about those in great detail. Ethnographies are another way of gathering data, and ethnographic research can involve doing interviews, but they're not quite the same as a survey. You're still asking people questions, but now you're interviewing them over a period of several hours, and perhaps even several hours on several different occasions. So you might be getting somebody's life story. And so let's say that you went to live in a village in the Amazon River Basin, and you lived in a village with native peoples there, and you could speak their language, and you would just live in the village, and you would ask people questions. You would sit down with them and let them tell stories about their lives, and you'd gather all this data, all this information, and make notes of everything that they're telling you about how their family was formed, and how their relationships with neighboring tribes have developed over decades of interactions with each other, and war started with this group, and now you've been at war with this group for generations perhaps, and where that conflict developed from, and all of that. So you're gathering a massive amount of information through all of these ethnographic interviews and through your observations of living amongst the group, and so that's what we call an ethnography. Now, it doesn't have to be quite that intense. I had a professor who was an anthropologist, and she was doing research into Mexican Americans that were living in a Dallas barrio. And so she moved into this Hispanic neighborhood, and she lived there for many years. And while she lived there, she would make notes about, she would go to civic meetings, and she would go to various activities within the community, and she was always observing and taking notes, and eventually she wrote a book about her experiences living in that community. And so it took many years to gather that data and to write the book, but it was a very informative book and very useful for those who wanted to understand what life was like in Dallas, Texas, in a Mexican neighborhood, for those people who live there. Okay, so that would be an ethnography, where you spend an extended period of time gathering data through observation and through interviews, and just watching participant observation. That's a really important way of gathering data. If you want to gather data, for example, I had a friend in my PhD program who wanted to understand more about how militia groups operate and what they're all about. And so he actually started hanging out with some guys who were in a militia group who every weekend would get together with their guns and run through the woods and, shoot at targets and do physical training. And I'm not sure what they were preparing for, but they were preparing for something. And he wrote his master's thesis and his doctoral dissertation about militia groups and how they function, or at least how that particular one functioned. Okay. So that would be an ethnographic study employing participant observation, because he got out there and ran through the woods carrying his gun and firing at targets and doing all that physical training, and then going out and hanging out with those militia members and getting to know more about how they see life and how they interact with each other. Okay. Of course, I've already mentioned social experiments. Psychologists do this, and certainly sociologists do as well. Social experiments allow you to put people into kind of a laboratory situation where you can kind of control a few of the outside variables. Now, some natural experiments occur out in the natural setting where you're just observing people out in the natural setting and you're not doing it in a laboratory. Then you have more external variables that influence things, and that can be problematic when you're trying to develop a theory and you've got other variables that you can't control or eliminate. And so, social experiments are a great way of getting to know about how people behave. But if those research subjects know that they're being studied, sometimes they will change their behavior to try to give the researcher what they think they want. And that can be problematic. And we call that the Hawthorne effect. And so hopefully you'll read about the Hawthorne effect in your textbook and become familiar with that. And that's just the idea that people's behavior often change when they realize that they're being studied. And this came from a study at a Hawthorne plant where they were manufacturing products, and they brought in somebody to try to figure out how to make the plant more efficient and increase productivity. And so this researcher did all kinds of things. They brightened the lights, they dimmed the lights, they changed the breaks and lunch schedule and all that kind of stuff. And everything they did seemed to increase the productivity of the workers. The lights were raised and made brighter, and productivity went up. So they thought, well, hey, brighten the lights can make people work faster. Then they dimmed the lights, and productivity went up even more. And they said, well, gosh, what happened? They finally realized that having someone standing around watching workers and making notes on a notepad would cause people to feel kind of scrutinized, and their behavior would change as a result of that. And so that's why we call it the Hawthorne effect. We see these people in this factory changing their behavior because they know they're being studied. And therefore, just knowing that you're being studied can cause you to change your behavior. It's not that your behavior is changing naturally due to some kind of variables that have been introduced. It's because you know you're being studied that you change your behavior. Okay. And then the final source that we'll talk about is what we call secondary analysis of existing sources. There's a lot of data that's collected, not necessarily for the purposes of research, but we have data sets that are collected like, mortality rates. We have disease, information, how many people are dying of different diseases and things of that nature. The government collects a tremendous amount of information. Universities collect a lot of information on different things. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Census Bureau. There's all this data out there that was collected for the purposes of social policy and things of that nature. In other words, if we're trying to figure out how much money we need to dedicate to unemployment, then we kind of need to know how many people are unemployed at any given time, how widespread the problem is. And so the government gathers a lot of data on a lot of these issues, and it's just sitting there. And if we want to make use of that data and we get permission from the government, a lot of times we can download their data sets and make use of that. So for example, the uniform crime reports from the FBI. The FBI gathers data on all kinds of criminal activities. There's 8 specific crimes that are very important, that are viewed as most central to what law enforcement does in this country. So you've got, those are broken into 2 categories. You've got crimes against persons or violent crimes, murder, robbery, rape, and those kinds of things. And then you've got 4 crimes that are crimes against property. So theft, larceny, theft, arson, burglary, and grand theft auto. Those are the 4 UCR property crimes. Well, when we gather data on all of that, we can say that, well, gosh, we hear all this information about how crime rates are just out of control, and it's a dangerous world out there. And the reality is that for the last 20 years, there's been a nice, slow, steady decline in crime rates. Even violent crime rates have gone down. And so this concern about, oh my gosh, we need to crack down on all these criminals because crime rates are just out of control, that's really not the reality. Certainly we want to continue to reduce crime rates as much as we can by employing effective policing policies and things of that nature. But we have to acknowledge that, if you look at the data, crime rates have been steadily declining over the last 20 years. And so something appears to have been working without cracking down on people, and making their lives miserable through, extensive policing efforts. Okay. So if we look at existing sources, and it doesn't just have to be a data set that was collected by a government agency. If we want to examine how women are viewed in the United States throughout our history, we can go back and look at old newspaper articles and old books and poems and songs and things of that nature, and examine how women are discussed in a variety of different settings throughout our history, and say, well, if you look at how women are discussed in the late 1700s versus the mid 1800s versus the mid 1900s versus today, I suspect that different language is used to describe women and the roles that they play in society today compared to some of those other time periods. So it doesn't just have to be, a government data set. It can be, newspaper articles, magazine articles, books, and things of that nature that we look at as existing sources. So those are the 4 primary types of research designs or ways of gathering data. We can design surveys and ask people questions directly about their thoughts and their behaviors. We can do experiments, and we can put people in different situations and see how they respond to different stimuli. We can do ethnographies where we just go in and spend a lot of time with people, and we let them tell their stories, and we ask questions, and we observe, and we participate. Or we can use existing sources. We can go and look at data that have already been collected that we think are going to, serve our purpose, and so we're looking at that. The good thing about existing sources is you don't have any ethical considerations because, in some cases, the people that you've studied, somebody else has already gathered the data, so you don't have to worry about harming them in the collection of the data. And some of those people may already be dead anyway. So, if we're looking at existing sources and we're going back and looking at historical sources from the founding of our country, clearly we're not going to harm any of those research subjects when we examine their writings and their diaries and their thoughts and things of that nature. Okay, so each of these research designs has its benefits and its disadvantages, its advantages and disadvantages. If we're thinking about surveys, they can be very useful because you can get data from a large number of people. But they can be expensive and time-consuming to get people to respond to surveys. Our college, when we do surveys of our students, we usually get about a 5 to 7% response rate. So if we've got 50,000 students and we get a 5% response rate, we're getting a few hundred or maybe a few thousand students out of 50,000, and that doesn't really tell us a whole lot about what most of our students think, right? And so you have to be careful about overgeneralizing the findings of a study to our whole population, student population, because if only 5% of students are answering, 95% of students are not filling out the survey, and that may not give us a very representative sample of our population, our student population. So there are some issues. You want to try to increase your response rate to your surveys. So, you do multiple mailings and you just nag people to fill out your survey. And hopefully that helps to increase the confidence you have in your survey results. But it can be time consuming and costly to do that. Okay. Now that we have internet surveys, it's a little better. We can use email and things of that nature. We don't have to mail everything out, or we don't have to call people on the phone and ask them phone surveys. Well, we can use the internet, but it makes it a lot easier for people to choose not to respond, right? If somebody gets an email, I suspect you guys have gotten emails from TCC about filling out some surveys, and many of you will just say, I don't have time for that. And I totally understand it. We're all very busy. But keep in mind that when TCC sends you a survey, we're trying to make the educational experience better for all of our students at TCC. So you really want your voice heard. If you can squeeze out enough time to do the survey, it's really helpful to the administration of the college to know what kind of challenges you guys face in getting your education and trying to help you meet those challenges. So if you do get a survey from TCC, please try to fill it out because your responses, your voice being heard is important, and it can help not only you but future generations of students at TCC as we're trying to improve the educational experience here. No, that's my public service announcement for institutional research. I spent a couple of years in the institutional research office here at TCC before I got into administration and then back into the classroom. So I understand the frustrations that folks in the institutional research department have as they're trying to gather data on students so they can inform administrators and policymakers at our college how best to meet your needs. Okay, so a survey is a study, generally an interview or a questionnaire that provides sociologists with information about how people think and act. As I said, all of you have filled out surveys. Many surveys are more marketing focused. They're trying to figure out how to get you to buy different products and things of that nature. That's marketing research. But for sociologists, we do research to try to figure out what are the challenges that you face and how can we help you meet those challenges. What are your thoughts? What behaviors have you engaged in? Those are the kinds of questions that people will ask. And of course, an interview is where you sit down with someone and they ask you questions either face-to-face or you can do a telephone interview. Today we can do Skype interviews, right? We can meet with people online using technology and we can interview them in that way. And then a questionnaire is just a mail out. It's a printed form or it's an electronic form that is mailed to someone for them to fill out and to return to the person who sent it or entity that sent it out. Okay. Surveys, as I said, the questions have to be worded very, very carefully in order to get the appropriate responses. Events that occur, if you had asked people about their attitudes about policing and race relations 6 months ago, you would have gotten very different results from many of the respondents than you would get if you asked those questions today because of some of the recent the conflicts that we've had in our society related to police brutality and police use of force and things of that nature. So, the protesters, the riots, and all of that could certainly influence people's opinions and thoughts about different race relations and things of that nature. So, societal events, historic occurrences can cause people to answer questions in a different way. We need to be aware of that. So, for example, your text says that the Bureau of Labor had to change the responses to unemployment questions back in 2010 because we had so much joblessness as a result of the stock market crash that occurred in 2008. So many people were unemployed that they actually had to change the way they asked the questions. Okay. All right, so we also can do what is called quantitative research, where we try to put most things into numbers. We rank people on different things. Some of those rankings are ordinal. In other words, if you're in the upper middle class, then that means that you probably make more money than someone in the lower middle class. Those are ordinal ranks. But sometimes it's just categorical differences. So if someone is a member of a Baptist church and they consider themselves to be a Baptist, that's different than being a Catholic, but it's not higher or lower than. Sometimes we're just categorizing people into different groups. And so we assign those different groups numbers. We might call Baptists 0s and Catholics 1 and Presbyterians 2 and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean that one is higher than the other or one is more valuable than the other. We're just assigning them numerical values, because when we do that, we can put all that data into a program like SPSS, the statistical package for the social sciences, SPSS, or even Excel. And we can run different statistical procedures such as frequency distributions and chi-squares and Pearson's R's and all of these kinds of statistical procedures, which you guys don't need to worry too much about in this class, but just be aware of them. But by doing that, by quantifying people's responses and assigning them numbers and putting it into a computer program, we're able to manipulate that data and analyze it and run statistical procedures that can really give us a good idea of what's going on. We can develop pie charts and bar charts, and to show the frequencies of different people's responses, and we can do chi-squares or crosstabs tables where we say, okay, this is how people feel about this issue based on their educational background. Okay, people with a high school degree feel this, or diploma feel this way. People with college degree feel this way. People with a doctoral degree feel this way, and so on and so forth. And that allows us to kind of drill down and see what the differences in our society really are and what they're based on, what characteristics they're based on. So that quantitative research can be very, very useful. Qualitative interviews involve more open-ended questions that can't be easily quantified. And so here we might do interviews with people where we ask them questions like, well, tell me how you felt when you tried to apply to TCC's programs. Tell us what kinds of problems you encountered, and just leave the question open, and then you go through a whole story of all the problems you faced when you tried to register for classes, when you tried to apply for admission into the college. And then we have to sort through all of that text. We're recording this, or we're having you fill out these open-ended questions with detailed answers, and then we have to go through and read all of that. It's very arduous to analyze the data from qualitative research, because you might be reading thousands of essays, explaining how people felt about different things, and then trying to come up with some way of grouping those together and determining what the major problems students face might be. That can be much more difficult than running a few statistical procedures in SPSS or even Excel and kind of summarizing data that way. So that's what we mean, the differences between qualitative research and quantitative research. A lot of surveys are quantitative. There are qualitative research surveys as well, but qualitative research often is done in ethnographies. A person who is doing lots of interviews that last hours and hours and doing many of those over a period of time will gather massive amounts of notes and data. And if they're recording their interviews, they may have hours and hours and hours of tapes to go through and listen to try to figure out what's going on in that particular situation with that group of people. Okay, so ethnographies can be, very qualitative in many cases, and they can be very detailed, and it can take years to do ethnographic research, certainly months in most cases. Okay. Ethnographic research can also involve gathering historical data. You're going back and having people tell stories in the past, conducting in-person interviews and things of that nature. Participant observation is used quite often in ethnographies. By doing ethnographies, you're putting yourself in the social setting that the person lives in, and you're trying to understand the world from their perspective. And that's very valuable, but it is extremely time-consuming and can take. Some researchers have lived for years among another group as they're collecting their data. So it can take quite a commitment to do that kind of ethnographic research. But while you are, trying to understand the world from their perspective, you can't go native, as the term goes. You have to be careful to remain detached. There's a tendency when you hear people's stories to become sympathetic and empathetic, and that's okay. But when you start doing your analysis, you need to try to remain objective and say, well, my heart aches for these people, but here are some things they're doing that is not necessarily beneficial to them in the long term. If they were being more careful in managing their money, perhaps they could avoid some of these particular issues that they've had to deal with. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about experiments. With experiments, you have a control group and you have an experimental group. You divide your population randomly into a control group and an experimental group, and then one group gets a placebo or no treatment, and the other group gets the experimental treatment. So if I wanted to see what the best way to teach sociology was, I might have one class that gets the traditional lecture method. I might have another class that does it through online learning, and then I might have a third class that does some 3D visualization, where we've got a cube on campus in an experimental classroom, and what they can do is they can put video on these three sides of this cube with 3D projectors, and you put on your 3D glasses and step into that, and you are almost transmitted into a new world. Okay, and so we could have students who were trying to learn about sociology step into the cube with their 3D glasses on, and Karl Marx could walk up to them and have a conversation with them about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and then Emil Durkheim could walk up and start talking about structural functionalism. Then you could get George Herbert Mead and Irving Goffman and Charles Horton Cooley could get together with you and start talking to you and having a conversation with you about symbolic interactionism and how it, how they see the world and how it all works. And that would probably be a great way for students to learn about sociological theories and paradigms through those interactions with those historical figures. And so then at the end of the semester, we could look at those three groups: the groups who got the regular classroom lecture, the group that got the online lecture format, kind of like what we're using this semester, and then the group that got the experiential educational program, where they went into the 3D cube and interacted with historical figures and sociologists who, showed them how these different theories work and how sociology works. And we could see which of those three groups learned the most sociology over the course of the semester. I have my own guesses, and you might have yours. I suspect that those students who were more active and were going into the cubes would probably learn and retain more sociology than the others. But I could be wrong, who knows? All right. And then with secondary sources, as we said, a lot of government agencies are collecting data. Universities are collecting data. When I was at LSU, we belonged to a group called ICPSR. We called it ICPSR. That's not a very appropriate term, probably, but it was a consortium. It's the International Consortium of Political and Social Research. And what we were doing was we were participating with other universities to share data with them. If they collected data on a particular thing, we could download that data set and use that data in our own research. If we gathered data, we could upload that data to ICPSR, and that data would then be made available to other researchers. So, and then of course, as we said, we can go back and look at historical, newspapers about historical events, newspaper articles. We could look at books, diaries, song lyrics. Any of that kind of stuff is appropriate when we're trying to analyze human behavior today compared to human behavior in the past. We can use any of those existing sources to get a more complete picture of how people thought and acted and felt about different things, right? Okay. Content analysis is another form of existing sources, and that's where you might go in and now analyze the content of song lyrics. You know, if we want to think about how music has depicted different conflicts in history, we could go and look at the songs that came out of of our society during World War I versus World War II versus Vietnam. And I suspect that we would see some marked differences in the way that we viewed those conflicts in the song lyrics that came out at that time. We know that during the Vietnam War period, a lot of bands were, producing music that was critical of the war. But if you go back to World War II, it was very different, right? We had music that was very patriotic and inspiring. You know, the idea was let's go over there and win that war and save the world from these evil Nazis and the Japanese who had attacked Pearl Harbor. So it was, totally different response in terms of our music about those wars and those conflicts and things of that nature. Okay, so. I also want to mention the ethics of sociological research. We have developed, because of some research that was done in the late 60s and early 70s that put human subjects at risk, we developed a code of ethics. The code of ethics started being developed back in the 70s, but it was revised in 1997, and so you can see the ASA's code of ethics in your textbook. A code of ethics is simply a set of standards of acceptable behavior that's developed by and for members of a profession. Psychologists have a code of ethics. Sociologists have a code of ethics. There are a number of main thoughts that we need to keep in mind in regards to the ethics of research. Number one is maintain objectivity and integrity in research. In other words, you can't cook your data. You can't make it come out the way you want it to come out. If your hypothesis is that A affects B, but you find out that A does not affect B, you can't say that it does. You have to be honest about it and say, you know what, my theory didn't hold up in this case. Okay, so you have to maintain your objectivity, and you have to be honest in reporting the results of your research. We also, number two, and this probably should be number one, respect the rights of the subject to privacy and dignity. So if we're doing research on human subjects, we have to keep in mind that they have a right to privacy and a right to dignity and to being protected from harm. Okay, and that's number three, protect our subjects from personal harm. That probably should be number one, right? It's very important. If we're going to do research that poses harms to people, we need informed consent, and we need the okay of our Institutional Review Board, or IRB, to do that research, because we believe that the potential for harm is minimal, and the gain that we get from doing that research outweighs those potential harms. That's a tough calculus to figure out. Okay. Number four, preserve confidentiality. In other words, we can't divulge information about our research subjects that will cause them problems. And we're going to see that Dr. Rick Scarce was willing to go to jail in order to protect his subjects' confidentiality. So if you're doing research in areas that could get people in trouble, and you're gathering data that divulges illegal activities and things of that nature, you might disapprove of that rule violating behavior, but you can't report that information to the police. You have to preserve confidentiality. If sociologists go around reporting things to police officers that they find out about, then nobody's going to want to do research with sociologists. They're going to, they're going to say, well, this is going to put me at risk, so I don't want to, participate in your research. So in order to protect the science and our subjects, we have to preserve their confidentiality. We also have to seek informed consent when we're doing research on people when they have an expectation, a reasonable expectation of privacy. If we're going in and gathering data and doing research, we have to get their permission. So we should seek informed consent when data are being collected from research participants or when the behavior occurs in a private context. Now, if you're just standing out in the quad, on a college campus and doing research, watching people, but you're not collecting any information on their identities, then you don't have to go and get an informed consent formed by everyone that you're observing. But if you are going into a particular setting where people have a right to privacy and you're collecting data from them, you probably need to identify yourself as a researcher, give them some vague idea of what kind of research you're looking at, and get their permission to collect data on them in order to remain, ethical in your research. Acknowledge any kind of research collaboration and assistance. If somebody is funding your research, you need to report that in your written report. You need to let people know that, hey, Exxon Corporation paid me to do research on jury verdicts, and that's why I'm asking you about your experience on this jury. When you publish that information, you need to let people know that, hey, this research was funded by the Pew organization or Exxon or whoever helped you get the funding together to do that research. And then disclose all sources of financial support. This was added in 1999. Again, when we've got companies that are encouraging us to do research into different things and they're willing to support our research through their finances, they may expect certain results and they may expect to be able to make use of that data. We have to be careful about that, okay? And we were talking about confidentiality, and that just means keeping information secret that could be damaging to people. Rick Scarce was doing research on animal rights activists, and they performed a raid. They carried out a raid on a university laboratory that was doing research on animals, and they stole the animals. Rick Scarce ended up spending some months in jail because he refused to testify and divulge what he knew about the people who were in that environmental group. Or the animal rights activist group. He refused to share that information, and he ended up spending sometime 159 days in jail as a result of that, but he did the right thing according to the code of ethics. He was correct in his assumption that he should protect the confidentiality of his researchers. Now, you would think animal rights activists, that's not a high-risk group to do research on. I suspect that Dr. Scarce did not know that these individuals were going to conduct this raid when he started doing research on them, and he kind of got pulled into this. But if you're doing research on groups that are protesting or that are activists and that might commit crimes, you have to be willing to ask the question, will I go to jail in order to protect my research subjects? And if the answer is no, then you might not want to do that research because ethically you might be put in a bind where you have to choose between your code of ethics and the law. Unfortunately, sociologists are not like priests or doctors or therapists. We don't have that that protection from divulging information about our research subjects. So the law does not recognize us as individuals who should be protected from having to testify against the people that we have data about, as a therapist might. So you don't have the legal protections, but you still have the ethical obligation to abide by that code of ethics. So again, it can be a tough decision. So keep that in mind, okay? That's probably a good place to break. I see we're an hour and 3 minutes into this, so I'm going to stop, and I'll come back and talk a little bit more about sociological research, but I think that's a good start. See you shortly.